Let's now have a look at the return statement. On php.net, in a search, let's simply type return in a lowercase, and that will take us to the return page. And what it says, return returns program control to the calling module. Execution resumes the statement following the called module's invocation. And before we go any further, let's go to the editor and have a look at actually what that means. Say we have something like a equals 1. Now we are going to have a function. Let's call it add1, and we are going to take argument, and then if we create curly brackets for this function, let's say return arg simply, actually we're going to pre-increment it, so it returns it already incremented by 1. So this is the function, and then we are going to call this function add1, and we are going to pass this argument a, and we are going to assign it to the b variable, and then we are going to echo this b variable. Now, the way the return will work here is basically, because PHP works in a synchronous way, basically reading the file from top to the bottom, and when it gets to the function, line by line basically, so we've got first line, first it assigns the value of integer 1 to the variable a, then we have function definition, then we go to this b variable when we are assigning whatever's inside of this, whatever's returned by this add1 function to this b variable, and then we echo this b variable to the browser. Now, what happens here at this specific stage, on this line 12 here, is when PHP hits this function, it gets to the function and does its job, basically. It doesn't go any further until this function has returned something, because this specific function returns some value. If it was the void function which doesn't return any value, then obviously it would have to process the code within this function as well before it goes to the next line, before it echoes anything. It wouldn't echo this before whatever's inside of this function has been fully executed. And the return statement tells the function this is the end of this function, basically. So if we say had something like arg, for instance, equals 10 for, on the next line, then this would be completely ignored. Once this return has been triggered, then the control goes back to the main file, to the global scope, as you may call it. So basically return, and then we go to the next line, echo b. So that's how it works. So it goes first line, then we go definition. Obviously, this is just for the PHP parser to know what the structure of this function is. Then we go to this line. This function is called. So we go inside of this function. We return in the value. At which point we go into the next line, and then we echo whatever we have associated with this b variable. So in other words, return terminates the script of the current scope. So if we are inside of the function, it will terminate this scope of the function, this private scope of the function. If we just now remove everything, we had something like this. Let's say echo first line, it's in a global scope. As you can see, we haven't got it wrapped in any function. And then we go for return null, for instance. And then we had another echo statement, second line, for instance. You can see my ID, I automatically highlights it because it knows we are in a global scope, and we triggered return language construct, because it's a language construct, which simply return null. But because we have this return, nothing after this line is going to be executed. So this is the end of the file, as you may call, basically, for PHP. If we now try it in the browser, as you can see, that's all we can see is the first line. After the return, we don't see the second line. Even if we preview the source of the page, that's all we can see. The return null has terminated the following line of the file we are actually calling, which is this, obviously, index.php. Let's go back to the specification for return, and then we have if called from within the function, the return statement immediately ends execution of the current function, which is what I just explained and showed you, and returns its argument as the value of the function call, which is basically what we did. We returned the argument incremented by 1. And obviously we could associate it with the b variable. Return also ends the execution of the eval. We're not going to be looking at this function statement or script file, so don't worry about this. Obviously worth knowing if you're ever gonna have to use this eval function. If called from the global scope, which is what we did just now, then execution of the current script file is ended. If the current script file was included or required, and we will look at both of these pretty soon, then control is passed back to the calling file. So if we include in the file, let's say we can have two different files, PHP files, one included inside of the other. And if we returned the value from within the one which we're including, then this statement, obviously the execution of the current script, goes back to the next line, basically in the parent file, as you may call it. But we will see this later on as well. If the current script file was, we've just read this. Furthermore, if the current script file was included, then the given value, then the value given to return will be returned as the value of the include call, and we will have a chance to test this as well. If return is called from within the main script file, then script execution ends, which is again pretty much the same what the first sentence says. Okay, and then we have a few notes. Note that since return is a language construct and not a function, the parentheses surrounding its arguments are not required. So we don't need these brackets basically around the return value. We just type return and then whatever we want to return. You can still use it, but as it says here, basically it is common to leave them out, and you actually should do so, as PHP has less work to do in this case. I tend to use brackets, the parentheses, when I'm actually doing some calculation, let's say some expression, let's say 1 is more than 3 or something like this, then I tend to include it within parentheses, basically return, and then obviously the expression within parentheses. But if it's just a variable, you don't need this. Then we have note. If no parameter is supplied, then the parentheses must be omitted and null will be returned. So you can simply trigger the return if we go back to our editor. And rather than returning null, we can simply do something like this. And that does exactly the same thing because it will return null by default. So if you go back to the browser, calling return with parentheses but with no arguments will result in a parse error. Let's try this as well. So I'm going to remove this second line, and I'm going to remove this first one because I want to try it just. So we're using parentheses without any variable, without any value parameter passed through. As you can see, we have this squiggly red line straight away. ID highlights it. And if we try it, there we go. We've got parse error, and it says syntax error, unexpected, closing bracket, because when you've got obviously the opening one, it still expects some value, but when you close it, this is basically when we have a problem because we haven't passed anything through it. That's why it's indicating the closing bracket. And this is exactly what this is telling us. Okay, let's now go back to the editor and have a look at a few of the other examples. We are going to start by defining a new function called update user. And what I'm going to do here is basically create a private variable year. I'm going to start 1970. Then we're going to have private function update year, which will take this, it will take an argument as a reference, and I'm going to call this basically argument year as well. But it's not the same as this private variable. It's a completely different one. We can call it whatever we want because we are passing this as an argument, and this is basically the name that's going to be used privately inside of this update year function. And what I'm going to do is basically overwrite it with 2015. And then what I'm going to do is update year. We are calling this function from within this update user. And actually, sorry, we need to pass some value, basically, the variable. And I'm going to use this private year variable here from within this update user scope. And then we are simply going to, rather than return it, we're going to echo it. And I did kind of mention this before, why we shouldn't echo anything from within the functions. But let's quickly have a look at the drawbacks, basically. What's going to happen if we use echo inside of the function instead of return statement. And let's say I want to associate this with a variable, and I'm going to call it simply variable, and I'm going to do update user. Well, actually, do you know what? Probably the best name for this would simply be user. And what I'm going to do, as you can see, my ID is automatically highlighting this. I'm going then try and var dump it to see what this user contains. If we save it and preview everything in the browser, refresh the page, and we get 2015 and null. And now what happens here basically is, why do we get this null? Where did this null come from? What happened here? When we called this function, we automatically printed this year to the browser. So this association here doesn't really make much sense, because this user is still empty. This is where we got this null from, because we var dump it. If we didn't var dump it, then we would simply have, if we save it now, preview in the browser, this 2015, because we echo from the function. We didn't associate anything with this user. That's why it was empty and gave us null. This is why returning is so much better, because if we return value from within the function, as you can see now highlight's gone, we are now associating the returned value with the variable. And now we don't have to print it in the browser at all. We can pass it on to the database, save it to the file, send it by email. We can do anything we want. We don't necessarily have to show it in the browser. When we echo from within the function, that will always get printed in the browser. And that's not always what we want to do. So remember, functions always do return, unless there's a really good reason for echoing anything. But 99%, you'll find out that basically return is what you want to use. So now we've associated this. What we should see now basically is this var dump function should return basically 2015, indicating also what type of the data is stored within this variable. Now, obviously, if we want to echo the value in the browser rather than var dump it, we can still use echo statement here with user and do it this way. If we preview it in the browser, refresh the page, we still get just 2015. And it's all working fine, but we have this extra functionality here now that if we want to do anything else with this variable, we can still do it. You could also do everything in line, so echo and assign at the same time. So basically, you can do it like this. You echo whatever's going to get associated with this variable, and while you're echoing, basically associates variable. Associates the returned value from this update user with this user variable. So you can do it this way as well, just a shorthand basically for the same thing.